Captain Elena Vasquez could feel the vibration in the cockpit controls before she heard the warning alarm. After 12 years of flying military transport aircraft across some of the world's most dangerous airspace, she'd learned to trust her instincts more than her instruments. Tonight, something was fundamentally wrong with the C-130 Hercules she was piloting through the mountains of Eastern Europe, and it wasn't just mechanical failure she was sensing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mission briefing had been unusually sparse. Evacuate civilian contractors from a research facility in the disputed territory of Moldanavia before rebel forces could capture strategic intelligence. Simple extraction, they'd said. Routine operation. But Elena had noticed the nervous energy in the briefing room, the way Colonel Matthews avoided eye contact when discussing the timeline, the suspicious absence of the usual backup aircraft that accompanied high-risk missions. As the aircraft shuddered again, Elena glanced at her copilot, Lieutenant Jake Harrison, whose white knuckles gripped the control yoke. Behind them, 23 civilian contractors sat in jump seats, trusting their lives to a transport plane that Elena was beginning to suspect had been cleared for flight, despite serious mechanical defects. The same institutional negligence that had destroyed her career at the Air Force Academy was now putting innocent lives at risk, and Elena was the only thing standing between these people and disaster. Elena had first noticed the pattern 3 months earlier during a routine maintenance inspection at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. As the senior transport pilot for the 86th Airlift Wing, she'd made it her practice to personally review the maintenance logs for any aircraft she'd be flying. It was a habit that had served her well since graduating from flight school 8 years after being expelled from the Air Force Academy, and it had saved lives more than once. The maintenance records for tail number 840125 showed a troubling history of hydraulic system warnings that had been repeatedly signed off as resolved without adequate documentation of actual repairs. Elena had seen this pattern before, during her cadet years at the academy when she'd tried to report similar corner cutting in the training aircraft. That time, her concerns had been dismissed as the complaints of a cadet who couldn't handle the pressure of military aviation. This time, she was a decorated captain with combat experience and a spotless safety record. Elena brought her concerns to Master Sergeant Rick Coleman, the maintenance chief who'd been keeping aircraft airworthy for nearly 3 decades. Coleman was a straight-talking mechanic from Texas who'd worked on everything from fighter jets to heavy transport aircraft, and Elena respected his judgment more than most officers twice his rank. When she showed him the maintenance logs, his weathered face grew serious. "Those hydraulic seals have been leaking for months," Coleman told her, his voice carrying the frustration of a professional who'd been fighting bureaucracy longer than Elena had been alive. "I've submitted work orders to replace the entire system, but they keep getting denied. New base commander says we're over budget on parts requisitions. They want us to keep patching things until the fiscal year resets." Elena stared at the grease-stained maintenance log, seeing not just numbers and signatures, but the faces of aircrew and passengers who trusted these aircraft with their lives. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same institutional pressure to cut corners, regardless of safety consequences, had followed her from the academy to active duty operations. She'd hoped that earning her wings and proving herself in combat would insulate her from the bureaucratic negligence that had derailed her cadet career. Instead, it seemed to be getting worse. "How many other aircraft are affected?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Coleman pulled out a thick folder filled with similar maintenance requests, all stamped with red denial marks. "About 40% of the transport fleet has some form of deferred maintenance. Hydraulics, electrical systems, engine components that should have been replaced months ago. We're basically flying on borrowed time and crossed fingers." Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition. This was exactly what had happened at the academy when she'd tried to report the training. Aircraft that had been cleared for flight despite documented engine problems. The difference was that now she wasn't a powerless cadet who could be silenced with threats of academic probation. She was a senior pilot with the authority to ground aircraft that didn't meet safety standards, and she intended to use that authority. The next morning, Elena submitted a formal safety report to Colonel Thomas Matthews, the base commander who'd implemented the cost-cutting measures. Matthews was a career logistics officer who'd been promoted to command based on his ability to reduce operational expenses rather than his understanding of aviation safety. Elena had worked under administrators like Matthews before, officers who saw aircraft maintenance as a budget line item rather than a life or death necessity. Colonel Matthews' office reflected his priorities. The walls were covered with efficiency awards and cost reduction certificates, rather than the aviation safety commendations that decorated most flight operations offices. When Elena was shown in for her meeting, Matthews was reviewing spreadsheets. On his computer, his attention more focused on financial data than the safety report she'd submitted. "Captain Vasquez," Matthews said without looking up from his screen, "I've reviewed your concerns about the maintenance program. While I appreciate your attention to detail, I think you're overestimating the significance of routine maintenance deferrals." Elena felt her jaw tighten. "Sir, these aren't routine deferrals. These are critical safety systems that have been operating outside acceptable parameters for months. The hydraulic systems on at least 12 aircraft are showing signs of imminent failure." Matthews finally looked at her, his expression suggesting he was dealing with an overwrought subordinate rather than an experienced pilot raising legitimate safety concerns. "Captain, I've been managing military logistics for 15 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I understand the balance between operational readiness and fiscal responsibility. These aircraft have been cleared by qualified maintenance personnel, and they meet all regulatory requirements for flight operations." Elena pulled out the folder Coleman had given her, containing detailed documentation of the deferred maintenance requests. "Sir, with respect, qualified maintenance personnel have been requesting parts and repairs that keep getting denied. We're not talking about cosmetic issues. We're talking about primary flight systems that could fail catastrophically during critical operations." The colonel's expression hardened. "Captain Vasquez, I'm aware of your history at the Air Force Academy. Your tendency to create problems where none exist and to challenge authority inappropriately. I had hoped that your operational experience would have taught you the importance of working within the system rather than against it." Elena felt the familiar sting of having her academy experience weaponized against her professional judgment. 8 years earlier, she'd been expelled from the academy for supposedly making false accusations against superior officers. In reality, she'd tried to report a culture of covering up safety violations and sexual harassment that the administration found inconvenient to address. The expulsion had forced her to earn her commission through officer candidate school and prove herself twice as hard as her peers to overcome the stigma of being an academy washout. "Sir, my concerns are based on documented maintenance deficiencies, not personal opinions. These aircraft are being flown beyond safe operational limits, and it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Matthews stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Captain, you have your orders. These aircraft have been cleared for flight operations by appropriate authorities. Your job is to fly them safely and efficiently, not to second-guess decisions made above your pay grade." As Elena left the colonel's office, she realized that the same institutional arrogance that had destroyed her academy career was now threatening the lives of aircrew and passengers across the base. But this time, she wasn't a powerless cadet who could be silenced with threats and intimidation. She was a senior pilot with connections throughout the Air Force aviation community, and she had no intention of watching people die to protect someone's budget numbers. Elena spent the next week documenting everything she could about the maintenance situation. She photographed hydraulic leaks, recorded serial numbers of components that were operating beyond their service limits, and compiled a comprehensive database of safety violations that painted a damning picture of systematic negligence. Her experience at the academy had taught her that institutional cover-ups only worked when there wasn't enough evidence to make the truth impossible to ignore. Her investigation revealed that the maintenance problems weren't limited to her wing. Elena reached out to pilots at other bases and discovered a pattern of deferred maintenance and safety corner-cutting that extended across multiple commands. Budget pressure from the Pentagon was forcing base commanders to choose between operational readiness and safety compliance, and most were choosing to gamble with safety rather than face career-ending accusations of fiscal irresponsibility. The most disturbing discovery came from her conversation with Captain Sarah Chun, a pilot at Dover Air Force Base who'd been dealing with similar maintenance issues. Sarah told Elena about a near-catastrophic incident 2 weeks earlier when a transport aircraft had lost primary hydraulic power during a mission over Afghanistan. Only the skill of the aircrew and pure luck had prevented a crash that would have killed 12 soldiers and 4 aircrew members. "They're calling it pilot error," Sarah said during a secure phone call, claiming that the crew didn't follow proper emergency procedures. "But I've seen the maintenance records for that aircraft." The hydraulic system had been flagged for replacement 3 times in the past 6 months. Command is covering up the mechanical failure to avoid questions about the maintenance program. Elena felt a familiar sense of déjà vu. The same pattern of institutional blame shifting that had destroyed her academy career was being used to protect administrators who prioritized budgets over safety. But this time, she had allies throughout the Air Force aviation community who were equally frustrated with the systematic erosion of safety standards. Elena's investigation took on new urgency when she learned that her own wing was scheduled for a high-priority mission to evacuate civilian contractors from the emerging conflict zone in Moldanavia. The mission would require flying into hostile territory with aircraft that she knew were operating beyond safe limits, carrying passengers who had no idea they were being put at unnecessary risk by administrative negligence. She tried one more time to work within the system, submitting a detailed safety assessment to the Inspector General's office at headquarters. The report included photographic evidence, maintenance records, and statements from mechanics and pilots at multiple bases. Elena documented the systematic pattern of safety violations and requested an immediate investigation before lives were lost. The response came back within a week, and it was exactly what Elena had expected based on her academy experience. The Inspector General's office acknowledged her concerns, but determined that base commanders had the authority to make operational decisions based on available resources. Her safety assessment was filed as a routine complaint with no further action required. Elena stared at the dismissive response and realized that the institutional culture she'd tried to change as a cadet had only gotten worse in the years since her expulsion. The Air Force was more interested in protecting the careers of administrators who could manipulate budget numbers than the lives of aircrew and passengers who depended on properly maintained aircraft. But Elena had learned something important during her years of proving herself after the academy disaster. Sometimes the system couldn't be reformed from within. Sometimes the only way to protect people from institutional negligence was to go around the system entirely, even if it meant risking everything she'd worked to rebuild. As she prepared for the Moldanavia mission, Elena began documenting everything about the aircraft selection, maintenance status, and mission parameters. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with the information, but her experience had taught her that when institutions chose to ignore problems, Sometimes individuals had to step forward and make the problems impossible to ignore. The mission briefing for the Moldanavia evacuation was scheduled for 2 days before departure, and Elena intended to use every hour until then to gather as much evidence as possible about the safety compromises that were putting lives at risk. She'd lost one career trying to protect people from institutional negligence. She wasn't about to let that happen again, regardless of the personal cost. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister Maria, who was finishing her senior year at the Air Force Academy. The message was simple but carried emotional weight that Elena felt in her chest. "Flying my first solo cross-country next week. Thanks for never giving up on your dream of wings, even when they tried to stop you. You showed me that setbacks don't define us." Elena stared at the message, thinking about the 8-year journey from academy washout to senior transport pilot. Every challenge, every extra hurdle she'd faced because of her expulsion. Every time she'd had to prove herself twice as hard as her peers. It had all been worth it to reach the point where she could protect others from the same institutional failures that had once threatened to destroy her own dreams. As she prepared to enter what might be another career-ending battle with Air Force bureaucracy, Elena felt a sense of clarity about her purpose. She hadn't survived the academy disaster and fought her way back to flight status just to watch other people get hurt by the same systematic negligence that had once been used against her. This time, she had the experience, the evidence, and the connections to make a difference. The only question was whether she'd have the courage to use them when the moment came to choose between her career security and the safety of the people counting on her to get them home alive. Based on everything she'd learned about institutional corruption and personal integrity over the past 8 years, Elena was beginning to suspect that choice was going to be made for her sooner than she'd hoped. 2 days before the Moldanavia mission, Elena found herself standing in the base maintenance hangar at 0500 hours, watching Master Sergeant Coleman and his team perform what they euphemistically called creative engineering on the hydraulic systems of the aircraft selected for the evacuation mission. The C-130 Hercules designated for the operation was the same aircraft she'd flagged in her safety report, tail number 840125, and watching the maintenance crew work around its known defects filled her with a growing sense of dread. Coleman emerged from beneath the aircraft, his coverall stained with hydraulic fluid and his expression grim. He approached Elena with the weary resignation of a professional who'd been forced to compromise his standards one too many times. "Captain, we've done everything we can with the parts we've got, but this bird's flying on borrowed time. The primary hydraulic pump is showing metal shavings in the filter, which means internal components are breaking down. We've cleaned it out and replaced the filter, but that's like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery." Elena examined the maintenance log that Coleman handed her, noting the long list of temporary fixes and deferred repairs that had accumulated over months of budget-driven negligence. "How long do you estimate before complete system failure?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would make her decision about the mission even more difficult. "In normal operations, maybe 100 flight hours. But you're talking about flying into a combat zone with potential hostile fire, emergency maneuvers, maximum stress on all systems." Coleman shook his head. "Could be 10 hours, could be 10 minutes. No way to predict when this thing decides to let go completely." Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was the aircraft commander. For this mission, which meant the lives of the aircrew and passengers were ultimately her responsibility. Military doctrine gave her the authority to abort any mission if she deemed the aircraft unsafe, but she also knew that Colonel Matthews would interpret such a decision as insubordination rather than prudent safety management. The passenger manifest for the Moldanavia mission included 23 civilian contractors who'd been working on classified research projects in the disputed territory. Intelligence reports indicated that rebel forces were advancing rapidly toward the facility, and this evacuation flight might be the last opportunity to extract these personnel before they were captured or killed. The moral complexity of the situation wasn't lost on Elena. Refusing to fly meant abandoning innocent people to an uncertain fate, but proceeding with an unsafe aircraft could result in everyone dying in a preventable crash. Elena's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Barnes, the deputy operations officer who'd been conspicuously absent from the mission planning sessions. Barnes was a former fighter pilot who'd transitioned to transport operations after a combat injury, and Elena had always respected her no-nonsense approach to aviation safety. The fact that Barnes was visiting the maintenance hangar at dawn suggested she had concerns about the mission that weren't being addressed through official channels. "Elena," Barnes said quietly, drawing her away from the maintenance crew, "I need to talk to you about something that's not going to appear in any official briefing. The intelligence picture for this Moldanavia operation is a lot worse than what you've been told. Enemy forces aren't just advancing toward the facility. They've got surface-to-air missile systems positioned along the primary flight corridors, and there's credible intelligence suggesting they're specifically targeting aircraft attempting evacuation operations." Elena felt her stomach drop. That information changes everything about the mission profile. Why wasn't this included in the briefing materials? Because Colonel Matthews doesn't want anything in writing that might complicate his narrative about routine evacuation operations. He's under pressure from headquarters to complete this mission without requesting additional resources or backup aircraft. Admitting that it's a high-risk operation would mean acknowledging that we need proper equipment and support, which contradicts his efficiency metrics. The pieces of institutional negligence were falling into place with sickening clarity. Elena realized that Matthews wasn't just cutting corners on maintenance to save money. He was deliberately concealing the true nature of combat operations to avoid the logistical and financial complications of providing adequate support for high-risk missions. The same bureaucratic mentality that prioritized budget performance over safety was now extending to operational security and mission planning. Barnes continued, her voice carrying the frustration of an experienced officer who'd been marginalized for raising inconvenient questions. "There's more. The extraction timeline has been accelerated because of political pressure from Washington. Originally, we were supposed to have 48 hours to plan and execute this operation. Now we've got less than 12 hours from wheels up to mission completion. No time for proper reconnaissance, no backup plans if things go wrong, no support. Assets positioned for emergency recovery." Elena stared at the C-130, its aging fuselage and patched components, a visible reminder of the systematic negligence that was now extending beyond maintenance issues to operational planning. The mission was becoming a perfect storm of institutional failures, unsafe aircraft, incomplete intelligence, inadequate support, and political pressure that prioritized speed over safety. Every instinct she'd developed as a pilot and every lesson she'd learned from her academy experience was telling her that this operation was designed to fail. "I need to ask you something," Elena said, making a decision that would define the rest of her military career. "If I document everything about this mission, the maintenance issues, the intelligence gaps, the timeline pressure, the lack of support assets, would you be willing to back me up if things go sideways?" Barnes was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face with the calculation of someone who'd navigated military bureaucracy long enough to understand the personal costs of challenging institutional authority. "Elena, if you go on record opposing this mission, Matthews will destroy your career. You know that, right? He's already got your academy history in his back pocket, and he'll use it to paint you as someone who can't handle pressure or follow orders." "I know exactly what I'm risking," Elena replied. "But I also know what happens when good people stay silent while bad decisions get people killed. I've been down that road before, and I'm not going there again." Barnes nodded slowly, her expression reflecting the respect of one professional warrior for another. "Then yes, if you're really going to document this systematic negligence, I'll provide whatever support I can. But you need to understand that once you cross this line, there's no going back." Matthews isn't just a bad administrator. He's got political connections that extend all the way to the Pentagon, and he'll use every bit of influence he has to protect himself. Elena spent the rest of the morning building a comprehensive case file that documented the multiple failures threatening the Moldanavia mission. She photographed the maintenance issues on the aircraft, recorded conversations with mechanics about the deferred repairs, and compiled intelligence reports that revealed the true scope of the operational risks. More importantly, she began reaching out to other personnel who were equally concerned about the safety compromises being made in the name of efficiency. Her first call was to Captain David Torres, a fellow transport pilot who'd been expressing similar concerns about the maintenance program. Torres had 15 years of experience flying combat missions, and his reputation for safety and professionalism made him an ideal ally in any challenge to Matthews' policies. When Elena explained what she was documenting, Torres didn't hesitate to offer his support. "Elena, I've been waiting for someone to coordinate resistance to these insane policies. Last month, I had to abort a mission over Syria because of hydraulic failure that should have been caught during routine maintenance. Matthews wrote me up for mission failure and threatened my fitness report. We can't keep pretending that budget cuts don't have real-world consequences for aircrew and passenger safety." Elena's next call was to Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, a maintenance supervisor who'd been fighting Matthews' cost-cutting measures since he'd taken command. Park had documented dozens of safety violations that had been ignored or covered up, and she'd been quietly building her own case file while waiting for an opportunity to bring the issues to light. When Elena reached out, Park was immediately willing to share her documentation and coordinate their efforts. "The maintenance situation is even worse than what you've seen with your aircraft," Park told Elena during a secure conversation in her office. "We've got critical components failing across the entire fleet, and we're being ordered to sign off on repairs that we know are inadequate. I've got mechanics who are afraid to fly on the aircraft they're supposed to be maintaining because they know how many corners we're being forced to cut." As Elena continued building her network of concerned personnel, a disturbing pattern emerged. Matthews wasn't just implementing cost-saving measures. He was systematically intimidating anyone who raised safety concerns, using performance evaluations and career threats to silence dissent. Several highly experienced non-commissioned officers had been transferred to undesirable assignments after questioning maintenance policies. 2 pilots had received negative fitness reports for what Matthews termed excessive caution in mission planning. The most shocking revelation came from Sergeant First Class Robert Kim, a maintenance quality assurance inspector who'd been documenting safety violations for months. Kim showed Elena a folder containing more than 50 incident reports that had been submitted to Matthews' office and subsequently disappeared from official records. The reports documented everything from hydraulic failures to electrical system malfunctions, all of which had been attributed to pilot error or normal wear rather than the systematic maintenance deficiencies that Kim's inspections had revealed. "They're not just covering up individual incidents," Kim explained. "They're rewriting the narrative to make it look like aircrew incompetence rather than institutional negligence. Every time something goes wrong, they find a way to blame the people operating the equipment rather than the administrators who refuse to maintain it properly." Elena realized that Matthews had created a comprehensive system for deflecting responsibility while putting lives at risk. By controlling the incident reporting process and manipulating performance evaluations, he could silence critics while building documentation that supported his narrative of efficiency and fiscal responsibility. The same institutional tactics that had been used to destroy her Academy career were now being deployed on a base-wide scale to protect an administrator whose policies were demonstrably dangerous. The scope of Elena's investigation expanded as more personnel came forward with evidence of systematic safety violations. Chief Master Sergeant Raymond Walsh, the senior enlisted advisor for the wing, provided documentation showing that maintenance-related incidents had increased by 300% since Matthews had implemented his cost-cutting measures. The statistics were damning, but Walsh explained that Matthews had been manipulating the reporting categories to hide the trends from higher headquarters. Captain Jennifer Lopez, a flight surgeon who'd been raising concerns about aircrew fatigue and stress related to unsafe aircraft, shared medical documentation showing increased anxiety and sleep disorders among pilots who were being forced to fly aircraft they knew were unsafe. The psychological impact of institutional negligence was manifesting in measurable health problems among the personnel, who were expected to risk their lives with inadequate equipment. As Elena compiled testimony and documentation from dozens of personnel across the base, she began to understand that the Moldanavia mission wasn't an isolated incident of poor planning. It was the culmination of months of systematic safety compromises that had created a culture where institutional loyalty was more important than professional competence. Matthews had surrounded himself with officers who prioritized administrative convenience over operational reality, and he'd systematically marginalized anyone who challenged his policies. The most disturbing aspect of Elena's investigation was the discovery that Matthews' policies weren't unique to their base. Through her contacts at other installations, she learned that similar cost-cutting measures were being implemented across multiple commands, all in response to budget pressure from Pentagon leadership that prioritized fiscal efficiency over operational safety. The institutional culture that had destroyed her academy career wasn't an isolated problem. It was a systematic issue that was affecting military, aviation safety throughout the Air Force. Elena's research revealed that Matthews had previously commanded 2 other installations where similar patterns of safety violations and personnel intimidation had occurred. In each case, he'd been promoted and transferred before the long-term consequences of his policies became impossible to ignore. The Air Force personnel system was actually rewarding administrators who could manipulate budget numbers, regardless of the human cost of their decisions. 2 days before the scheduled departure for Moldanavia, Elena received an unexpected visit from Colonel James Harrison, the Inspector General representative from headquarters who dismissed her earlier safety report. Harrison arrived unannounced at Elena's quarters, his presence suggesting that her investigation had attracted attention at levels she hadn't anticipated. "Captain Vasquez," Harrison said without preamble, "I understand you've been conducting an unauthorized investigation into base operations and collecting statements from personnel about command policies." Elena felt a familiar chill of recognition. The same tone, the same assumption of wrongdoing that had characterized her academy disciplinary proceedings. But this time, she was prepared for institutional intimidation, and she had allies who were willing to stand with her. "Sir, I've been documenting safety violations that pose immediate risks to aircrew and passenger lives. All of my activities have been within the scope of my duties as aircraft commander for the Moldanavia mission," Harrison's expression suggested. He was dealing with an insubordinate officer rather than someone raising legitimate safety concerns. "Captain, your history of making unfounded allegations against superior officers is well documented. The Air Force Academy Incident Report specifically notes your tendency to create conflicts and challenge authority inappropriately." Elena felt the anger that had sustained her through 8 years of proving herself after the Academy disaster. "Sir, my concerns are based on documented evidence of systematic safety violations, not personal opinions. I have photographic evidence, maintenance records, and statements from qualified personnel that demonstrate a pattern of institutional negligence that is putting lives at risk." Harrison leaned forward, his voice carrying the implicit threat that Elena had learned to recognize during her academy experience. "Captain Vasquez, you're scheduled to fly a critical mission in 48 hours. Your focus should be on mission accomplishment, not on second-guessing decisions made by officers with more experience and broader perspective than you possess. Any further unauthorized investigation or documentation will be considered insubordination and dealt with accordingly." As Harrison left her quarters, Elena realized that her investigation had triggered the same institutional response that had destroyed her academy career. The Air Force was more interested in protecting administrators who could manipulate appearances than addressing systemic problems that threatened lives. But this time, she wasn't a powerless cadet who could be silenced with threats and academic punishment. She was a senior pilot with documented evidence and a network of allies who were equally committed to preventing the next preventable tragedy. Elena spent that evening organizing all of her documentation into a comprehensive case file that painted a devastating picture of institutional negligence. She had maintenance records, personnel statements, statistical analyses, and photographic evidence that demonstrated a systematic pattern of safety violations, extending from base-level operations to Pentagon-level policy decisions. More importantly, she had the contact information for investigative journalists and congressional oversight committees who specialized in military accountability issues. Her phone rang at 2,200 hours with a call from Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, whose voice carried an urgency that immediately put Elena on alert. "Elena, you need to know that Matthews called an emergency staff meeting tonight. Word is that he's implementing new protocols for mission documentation and personnel accountability. Anyone found to be conducting unauthorized investigations or sharing operational information with unauthorized personnel will face immediate disciplinary action." Elena felt the familiar pattern of institutional retaliation accelerating around her. Matthews wasn't waiting for her to complete the Moldanavia mission before moving against her. He was eliminating potential problems before they could become public embarrassments. But his heavy-handed tactics were also creating more evidence of the systematic intimidation that Elena had been documenting. "There's something else, Barnes continued. I just received word that the departure time for the Moldanavia mission has been moved up by 12 hours. We're now launching at 0600 tomorrow instead of 1800. No explanation provided. No additional preparation time. No opportunity to address the aircraft maintenance issues that you've been documenting." Elena stared out her window at the flight line, where she could see maintenance crews working under floodlights to prepare the aircraft for a mission that she knew was designed to fail. The institutional negligence that had been building for months was now converging into a perfect storm of safety violations, operational inadequacy, and administrative cover-up. In less than 8 hours, she would be expected to risk her life and the lives of her passengers to protect the career of an administrator whose policies had created the crisis. As Elena prepared for what might be her final mission as an Air Force pilot, she made a decision that would define not just her career, but potentially the future of military aviation safety. She opened her laptop and began composing a detailed email to Senator Patricia Williams, the chairwoman of the Senate Armed Services Committee's Subcommittee on Military Readiness. The email included every piece of documentation she'd assembled, along with a comprehensive analysis of the institutional failures that were about to culminate in the Moldanavia disaster. Elena attached photographs, maintenance records, personnel statements, and statistical analyses that painted an undeniable picture of systematic negligence. She documented Matthews' pattern of intimidation and retaliation, the Pentagon budget pressures that were driving safety compromises, and the institutional culture that prioritized administrative convenience over human lives. Most importantly, she included a detailed timeline showing how the current crisis had developed over months of ignored warnings and suppressed safety concerns. Before sending the email, Elena wrote a personal note explaining her motivation for risking her career to expose institutional negligence. She referenced her academy experience and the 8-year journey that had brought her to this moment of moral decision. She acknowledged the potential consequences of her actions while expressing her conviction that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. As Elena prepared to send the email that would likely end her military career, she thought about her sister Maria, who was following in her footsteps at the Air Force Academy. She thought about the thousands of aircrew and passengers who depended on military transport aircraft every day, trusting their lives to institutions that Elena now knew were systematically compromising safety for administrative convenience. She thought about the 23 civilian contractors who would be boarding her aircraft in 6 hours, unaware that they were being put at unnecessary risk by budget-driven negligence. Elena clicked send at exactly 2,300 hours, knowing that she had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The email would reach Senator Williams' staff within minutes, setting in motion a chain of events that would either expose the institutional corruption she'd documented or destroy her career in retaliation for challenging authority. Based on everything she'd learned about military bureaucracy over the past 8 years, Elena suspected it would be both. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Master Sergeant Coleman. Aircraft 840125, showing additional hydraulic leaks during final pre-flight inspection. Recommend mission delay for emergency repairs. Request your guidance as aircraft commander. Elena stared at the message, realizing that the moment of ultimate decision had arrived even sooner than she'd expected. In 6 hours, she would be expected to fly an unsafe aircraft into hostile territory to evacuate civilians whose lives depended on equipment that her own maintenance crew was telling her was likely to fail. Every instinct she'd developed as a pilot, every lesson she'd learned from her academy experience, and every principle she'd fought to defend over 8 years of military service was telling her that this mission was a preventable disaster waiting to happen. The question now wasn't whether she could afford to challenge institutional authority again. The question was whether she could afford not to. Part 3. The final confrontation. Elena stood on the flight line at 0430 hours, watching the pre-dawn maintenance crews make final preparations on aircraft 840125 while knowing that every minute of delay increased the political pressure that was driving this dangerous mission forward. The hydraulic leak that Coleman had reported was visible even in the dim hangar lighting, a steady drip of critical fluid that represented everything wrong with the institutional negligence she'd been fighting for months. Lieutenant Jake Harrison, her co-pilot for the mission, approached with a pre-flight checklist and an expression that suggested he shared her concerns about the aircraft's condition. "Captain, maintenance is asking for your signature on a conditional release form. They're certifying the aircraft as flyable for this specific mission only, with the understanding that it will require immediate grounding for major repairs upon return." Elena examined the maintenance form, noting the careful legal language that transferred responsibility for the aircraft's condition from the maintenance crew to the flight crew. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that allowed administrators like Matthews to avoid accountability while putting operational personnel at risk. By signing the form, she would be accepting personal responsibility for flying an aircraft that everyone knew was unsafe. The passenger manifest for the evacuation included 23 civilian contractors who had been working on classified research projects at the remote facility in Moldanavia. Elena had reviewed their profiles during mission planning, noting that most were scientists and engineers with no military experience, who would be completely dependent on her crew's ability to get them out of hostile territory safely. The weight of their trust felt heavier than the aircraft itself as she contemplated the impossible choice between abandoning innocent people and risking everyone's lives with unreliable equipment. Elena's contemplation was interrupted by the Arrival of Colonel Matthews, who appeared on the flight line with an entourage of staff officers and the purposeful stride of someone ensuring that his orders were being followed without deviation. His presence at this hour suggested that he was personally invested in the mission's success, probably because of the political pressure he was receiving from higher headquarters about the evacuation timeline. "Captain Vasquez," Matthews said without preamble, "I trust you've completed your pre-flight preparations and are ready for on-time departure." Elena felt the familiar tension of dealing with an administrator who prioritized schedule adherence over safety considerations. "Sir, we've identified additional maintenance concerns that warrant delay for proper repairs. The hydraulic system is showing signs of imminent failure that could compromise flight safety during the mission." Matthew's expression hardened with the impatience of someone who'd already decided that safety concerns were secondary to operational requirements. "Captain, this aircraft has been cleared for flight by qualified maintenance personnel. Your job is to execute the mission as briefed, not to second-guess decisions made by people with more experience than you have." Elena realized that Matthews was deliberately forcing her into the same impossible position that had defined her academy experience. Accept institutional negligence and risk lives, or challenge authority and face career destruction. But this time, she had 8 years of operational experience and a documented case file that exposed the systematic nature of the problems she was being asked to ignore. "Sir, with respect, I have significant concerns about aircraft reliability for this high-risk mission. I'm recommending that we delay departure until proper repairs can be completed, or substitute a different aircraft with documented airworthiness." Matthews stepped closer, his voice carrying the implicit threat that Elena had learned to recognize during her years of fighting institutional pressure. "Captain Vasquez, your tendency to create problems where none exist is well documented. Your academy record shows a pattern of insubordination and false accusations against superior officers. I had hoped that operational experience would have taught you the importance of following orders and working within the system, but apparently some people never learn." Elena felt the anger that had sustained her through 8 years of proving herself after the academy disaster. The same institutional tactics that had been used to destroy her cadet career were now being deployed to silence her professional judgment as a senior pilot. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone, and she had documentation that exposed the systematic nature of the corruption she was being asked to enable. "Sir, my concerns are based on documented evidence of safety violations, not personal opinions. I have maintenance records, inspection reports, and expert testimony that demonstrate this aircraft is operating beyond safe limits. Flying this mission with known mechanical defects would be a violation of Air Force safety regulations and my responsibilities as aircraft commander." Matthews' response confirmed Elena's suspicion that this confrontation had been orchestrated to force her into a position where she would either comply with dangerous orders or face immediate disciplinary action. "Captain, you have a direct order to execute this mission as planned. Any refusal to comply will be considered insubordination and dealt with accordingly. Your choice is simple. Follow orders like a professional officer, or face the consequences of continued defiance." Elena looked around the flight line at the faces of her crew, the maintenance personnel, and the staff officers who were witnessing this confrontation. She could see in their expressions the same recognition that had characterized her academy experience. Everyone understood what was happening, but institutional pressure made it dangerous for anyone to openly support her position. The system was designed to isolate individuals who challenged authority, making resistance appear to be personal defiance rather than professional necessity. "Colonel, I need to speak with you privately about operational security concerns that weren't addressed in the mission briefing." Elena's request was a calculated gamble, an attempt to create space for negotiation while avoiding the immediate confrontation that Matthews was trying to force. His expression suggested irritation at the delay, but the mention of operational security made it difficult for him to refuse without appearing to ignore legitimate military concerns. They walked to a position away from the assembled personnel, and Elena used the opportunity to present her most compelling arguments about the mission's fundamental flaws. Sir, intelligence reports indicate that enemy forces have surface-to-air missile capabilities positioned along our planned flight route. Combined with the aircraft's hydraulic problems, we're facing a situation where mechanical failure and hostile fire could create an unrecoverable emergency. Matthew's response revealed the political pressure that was driving his inflexibility about the mission timeline. Captain, Washington wants these contractors evacuated immediately, before the situation deteriorates further. Delaying this mission means abandoning American citizens to potential capture or execution. The risk assessment has been completed at levels above both of us, and the decision has been made to proceed. Elena realized that Matthews was operating under the same institutional pressure that had characterized her academy experience. Higher authorities had made decisions based on political considerations rather than operational reality, and field commanders were expected to implement those decisions regardless of safety consequences. The difference was that now she had the documentation and connections to expose the systematic nature of the negligence. Sir, I understand the political urgency, but I also understand my legal and moral responsibilities as aircraft commander. If this mission proceeds with known safety defects and people die as a result, the responsibility will fall on the operational personnel who implemented it, not the administrators who ordered it. That's exactly what happened at my previous assignments, where similar cost-cutting measures led to preventable casualties. Matthew's expression suggested that Elena had touched on something he preferred not to discuss. The implication that he had previous experience with missions that had gone wrong due to administrative negligence was clearly accurate, and Elena suspected that his defensive response confirmed her research about his track record at other installations. Captain, you're relieved of command for this mission. I'll assign another pilot who understands the importance of following orders without creating unnecessary complications. Elena felt a moment of relief that she wouldn't be forced to risk lives with unsafe equipment, followed immediately by concern for whoever would be assigned to fly the mission in her place. Sir, any pilot you assign will face the same safety concerns I've raised. The problems with this aircraft aren't matters of opinion. They're documented mechanical defects that pose risks regardless of who's flying. Matthews was already walking away, his body language indicating that the discussion was over. Captain Harrison will assume command of this mission. You're confined to quarters pending administrative action for insubordination and failure to follow direct orders. Elena watched Matthews stride back toward his staff officers, knowing that she had just crossed the line that would either vindicate her position or destroy her career entirely. Lieutenant Harrison approached her with the reluctant expression of someone who understood the position he was being placed in. Captain, I want you to know that I agree with your safety assessment. This aircraft shouldn't be flying this mission. But Matthews has made it clear that refusing the assignment will result in court-martial proceedings for the entire crew. Elena felt the weight of institutional pressure that was designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance she had been mounting. By threatening the careers of multiple personnel, Matthews was ensuring that someone would fly the mission regardless of safety concerns. The system was structured to make individual resistance appear selfish rather than principled. Jake, I need you to document everything that happens during this mission. Take photographs of any mechanical problems, record all communications with ground control, and make detailed notes about aircraft performance. If something goes wrong, there needs to be evidence about what actually happened versus what the official reports will claim. Harrison nodded, understanding the implications of Elena's request. If the mission resulted in casualties, there would Efforts to blame pilot error rather than acknowledge the systematic negligence that had created the dangerous situation. Elena's documentation efforts over the past months had prepared her for exactly this scenario. Elena returned to her quarters under escort, but not before making several phone calls that would ensure her investigation continued regardless of her personal situation. Her first call was to Master Sergeant Coleman, asking him to photograph and document every aspect of the aircraft's condition before and after the mission. Her second call was to Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, requesting that she monitor communications during the mission and document any unusual circumstances. Most importantly, Elena called Senator Williams' office directly, speaking with a staff member who had been expecting her contact since receiving the comprehensive documentation she had sent the previous evening. The conversation was brief but significant. The Senator's committee was already initiating a formal investigation into military aviation safety practices, and Elena's case file provided exactly the kind of systematic evidence they needed to justify comprehensive oversight. Hearings. Senator Williams wants you to know that your documentation has provided crucial insight into problems that extend far beyond your individual installation. The staff member told Elena, "We've been receiving reports from multiple sources about similar safety compromises throughout the Air Force, but nobody has provided the level of detailed evidence that you've assembled. This investigation will proceed regardless of any retaliation you might face." Elena felt a sense of vindication mixed with apprehension about the immediate consequences of her actions. The institutional machinery that had been used to silence her academy concerns was now mobilizing against her again, but this time she had allies at levels that could challenge the system rather than being absorbed by it. Her phone rang an hour later with a call from Jake Harrison, whose voice carried the tension of someone dealing with multiple emergencies simultaneously. "Elena, we've got serious problems. The hydraulic system failed completely during taxi, and we've got fuel leaks from the wing tanks. Coleman's team is trying to patch things together, but this aircraft is completely unsafe for flight operations." Elena felt a grim satisfaction that her safety assessment had been validated, mixed with concern about the political pressure that would be applied to make the mission proceed despite obvious mechanical failures. "Have you reported the aircraft status to Colonel Matthews?" "That's where things get complicated. Matthews is ordering the maintenance crew to sign off on temporary repairs and demanding immediate departure. He's telling everyone that mission delay isn't acceptable regardless of aircraft condition." Elena realized that Matthews was so committed to the evacuation timeline that he was willing to risk catastrophic failure rather than acknowledge that his policies had created an unsafe situation. The institutional pressure to avoid admitting mistakes was driving decisions that made the original problems exponentially worse. "Jake, you need to understand that you have the legal authority and moral obligation to refuse to fly an unsafe aircraft. Military regulations are clear about aircraft commander responsibilities, and no administrative pressure can override your duty to ensure crew and passenger safety." Harrison was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the same institutional pressures that had defined Elena's military experience. "Elena, Matthews has made it clear that refusing this mission will result in court-martial proceedings for insubordination. He's also threatening the maintenance crew with disciplinary action if they don't certify the aircraft as airworthy. The whole system is designed to force someone to take responsibility for flying this death trap." Elena's anger at the institutional manipulation was overshadowed by her concern for the people who were being coerced into risking their lives to protect an administrator's career. The systematic negligence that had started with budget cuts had evolved into criminal recklessness that threatened multiple lives, while ensuring that blame would fall on operational personnel rather than administrative decision-makers. Her phone rang again, this time with a call from Dr. Sarah Chun, the pilot from Dover Air Force Base, who had been dealing with similar maintenance issues. Elena, I just heard about your situation through our network. You need to know that Senator Williams' office has been calling bases throughout the Air Force asking about safety violations and administrative retaliation. Your case has opened floodgates that Matthews can't control. Elena felt a surge of hope that the systematic nature of the problem she'd been documenting was finally receiving the attention it deserved. Is there any word about intervention in our immediate situation? The Moldanavia mission is still being pressured forward despite documented safety failures. That's why I'm calling. Senator Williams has contacted the Pentagon directly about your case, and there are people at very high levels who are asking serious questions about operational safety and command accountability. The political protection that has been shielding people like Matthews is starting to crumble. Elena's sense of vindication was interrupted by another call from Harrison, whose voice now carried genuine panic. Elena, you need to get down here immediately. Matthews has assembled the entire wing leadership and is demanding that someone fly this mission regardless of aircraft condition. He's threatening disciplinary action against anyone who refuses, including the maintenance crew who won't sign off on the repairs. Elena realized that Matthews was forcing a confrontation that would either result in multiple casualties or expose his systematic negligence to scrutiny he couldn't control. Either outcome would likely end his career, but the immediate danger was to the people he was coercing into implementing his dangerous decisions. Elena left her quarters despite her confinement and headed toward the flight line, knowing that her presence would likely result in additional disciplinary charges, but unable to stand by while others were forced to risk their lives to protect Matthew's administrative convenience. The scene she encountered was exactly what she had expected based on her academy experience. Matthews had assembled all the key personnel and was applying maximum pressure to force compliance with his orders. The aircraft sat on the tarmac with visible hydraulic fluid pooled beneath it and fuel vapors that were clearly detectable from 50 yards away. Master Sergeant Coleman stood with his maintenance crew, all of whom were visibly reluctant to certify an aircraft they knew was unsafe. Lieutenant Harrison and his aircrew looked like they were preparing for a suicide mission rather than a routine evacuation operation. Captain Vasquez, Matthews said when he noticed her arrival, "You're supposed to be confined to quarters pending disciplinary action. Your presence here constitutes additional insubordination that will be reflected in the charges against you." Elena ignored the threat and walked directly to the aircraft, where she could assess the mechanical problems firsthand. The hydraulic leak had worsened significantly, creating a puddle of critical fluid that represented a complete system failure waiting to happen. The fuel leak from the wing tank was creating vapor concentrations that posed fire and explosion risks even during ground operations. Any competent evaluation would have grounded this aircraft immediately, but Matthews was demanding that it be flown into combat conditions. "Colonel, this aircraft is demonstrably unsafe for any flight operations, let alone a combat mission. No amount of administrative pressure can change the physical reality of these mechanical failures." Elena's statement was delivered loudly enough for all assembled personnel to hear, creating the kind of public record that made institutional cover-up more difficult. Matthews' response confirmed Elena's assessment that he was more concerned about protecting his career than ensuring mission safety. "Captain Vasquez, you've been relieved of all duties related to this mission. Your unauthorized presence here and continued interference with operational requirements will result in additional charges including obstruction of military operations." Elena looked around at the faces of the personnel who were being forced to choose between their careers and their lives. She could see the same recognition that had characterized her academy experience. Everyone understood what was happening, but institutional pressure made it dangerous to resist openly. The difference was that this time she had documentation and external support that could challenge the system. "Colonel Matthews, I'm formally documenting my assessment that this aircraft is unsafe for flight operations and that proceeding with this mission constitutes reckless endangerment of military personnel and civilian passengers. My statement is being recorded and will be forwarded to appropriate oversight authorities, regardless of any disciplinary action you might take against me. Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number with a Washington area code. She answered immediately, hoping it might be related to Senator Williams' investigation. Captain Vasquez, this is General Patricia Rodriguez, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at the Pentagon. I'm calling to inform you that all operations at your installation are suspended, pending immediate investigation of safety violations and command accountability issues. Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with vindication as she realized that external pressure had finally reached levels that Matthews couldn't ignore or suppress. General Rodriguez continued, Colonel Matthews has been relieved of command effective immediately, and a team of investigators is en route to your location. The Moldanavia mission is canceled until proper aircraft and support can be provided. Matthews' expression shifted from administrative confidence to genuine panic as he realized that his political protection had evaporated and that his systematic negligence was now subject to investigation by authorities he couldn't control or intimidate. The institutional machinery that had been used to suppress safety concerns was suddenly focused on exposing the truth rather than protecting careers. General Rodriguez, Elena said, there are 23 civilian contractors in hostile territory who still need evacuation. Can alternative resources be provided for a properly planned and equipped mission? The general's response reflected the kind of competent military planning that had been absent from Matthews' approach. Captain, we're deploying a full combat search and rescue package with multiple aircraft, fighter escort, and emergency medical support. The mission will be executed by crews with proper equipment and adequate backup resources. This is how evacuation operations are supposed to be conducted when competent leadership is in charge. Elena looked around the flight line at the personnel who had been coerced into risking their lives to protect Matthews' administrative convenience. Master Sergeant Coleman was grinning with the satisfaction of a professional who had finally been vindicated. Lieutenant Harrison looked like he had been granted a reprieve from a death sentence. The maintenance crew was already beginning to properly ground the unsafe aircraft. Matthews approached Elena with the defeated expression of someone whose career had just ended in disgrace. Captain Vasquez, I want you to know that your actions have destroyed not just my career, but the careers of everyone who tried to implement necessary efficiency measures. You've chosen personal vindication over institutional loyalty. Elena felt the same clarity that had sustained her through 8 years of fighting institutional pressure since her academy experience. Colonel, I chose professional integrity over administrative convenience. I chose the safety of aircrew and passengers over the protection of careers built on systematic negligence. Those aren't difficult choices for someone who understands what military service actually means. 3 hours later, Elena stood on the same flight line watching a properly equipped combat search and rescue mission depart from Moldanavia. The package included 2 transport aircraft with full maintenance certification, fighter escort, aerial refueling support, and emergency medical capabilities. The contrast with Matthews' approach was stark and demonstrated exactly why his cost-cutting measures had been so dangerous. Elena's phone rang with a call from Senator Williams herself, whose voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had successfully challenged institutional corruption. Captain Vasquez, I want to personally thank you for the courage to expose systematic problems that were affecting military aviation safety throughout the Air Force. Your documentation has provided the foundation for comprehensive reforms that will prevent future tragedies. Senator, Elena replied, I just did what any professional military officer should do when confronted with institutional negligence that threatens lives. The real heroes are the maintenance personnel, aircrew, and support staff who were willing to stand up despite career risks. Captain, the Senate Armed Services Committee will be conducting oversight hearings about military aviation safety, and your testimony will be crucial for ensuring that the reforms we implement actually address the systematic problems you've documented. We need people with your experience and integrity to help design policies that prioritize safety over administrative convenience. Elena felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since her academy experience 8 years earlier. The fight against institutional negligence that had started with her expulsion had finally reached a level where systematic change was possible. The network of allies she had built throughout her military career was now positioned to prevent other people from facing the same impossible choices between career security and professional integrity. 6 months later, Elena stood in the Senate hearing room watching Colonel Matthews testify about his policies at multiple installations where safety violations had resulted in preventable casualties. The investigation had revealed a pattern of systematic negligence that extended far beyond her individual case, validating every concern she had raised about institutional culture and administrative accountability. The hearing room was filled with military personnel who had been affected by similar policies, all of whom had found the courage to come forward once Elena's case had demonstrated that systematic resistance was possible. Master Sergeant Coleman sat in the front row, his 29 years of maintenance experience providing crucial testimony about the technical aspects of the safety violations. Senator Williams questioned Matthews about his track record at multiple installations, using Elena's documentation to expose the pattern of corner cutting and intimidation that had characterized his administrative approach. His defensive responses and attempts to blame subordinates only reinforced the systematic nature of the problems that Elena had been documenting. Captain Vasquez, Senator Williams said when Elena was called to testify, "Your actions have resulted in comprehensive changes to military aviation safety policies and command accountability procedures. Can you tell us what motivated you to risk your career to expose these problems?" Elena thought about her 8-year journey from academy washout to senior pilot, the thousands of aircrew and passengers who depended on military aviation safety, and the institutional culture that had prioritized administrative convenience over human lives. "Senator, my motivation was simple. Military service means accepting responsibility for protecting others, even when that protection requires challenging the very institutions we serve. Some principles are worth defending regardless of personal cost. Some fights are worth having even when you can't be sure you'll win. And sometimes when institutions fail to protect the people they're supposed to serve, individuals have to step forward and do what's necessary to prevent preventable tragedies." Elena's testimony was followed by comprehensive policy changes that established new standards for military aviation safety, command accountability, and personnel protection from retaliation. The institutional culture that had destroyed her academy career and threatened countless lives through systematic negligence was finally being challenged by people who understood that true military strength came from competence and integrity rather than administrative manipulation. As Elena left the Senate hearing room, she received a text message from her sister Maria, who had just graduated from the Air Force Academy and was beginning her own military career. "Thanks for showing me that setbacks don't define us and that fighting for what's right is always worth the cost. You proved that one person with courage really can change the system." Elena looked out at the Washington skyline, thinking about the 23 civilian contractors who had been safely evacuated from Moldanavia by properly equipped and competently led rescue forces. She thought about the maintenance personnel, who could now report safety violations without fear of retaliation. She thought about the aircrew who would fly safer aircraft because institutional accountability had replaced administrative convenience. The fight against systematic negligence that had started with her academy expulsion had finally reached a conclusion that validated every principle She had been willing to sacrifice her career to defend the institutional culture that prioritized careers over competence was being replaced by policies that recognized the fundamental connection between integrity and effectiveness. Elena Martinez had been kicked out of flight school for challenging institutional corruption. 8 years later, she had saved not just the lives of people threatened by that same corruption, but the institutional integrity of the military aviation system itself. Some fights were worth having, regardless of the personal cost. Some principles were worth defending, even when the institutions you served tried to destroy you for upholding them. The academy washout had become the catalyst for systematic reform that would protect countless future aircrew and passengers from the kind of preventable tragedies that institutional negligence created. Elena's refusal to accept that administrative convenience was more important than human lives had ultimately transformed the very system that had once tried to silence her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.